All right, today we're going to dive into a pretty fascinating source called Divine Blueprints. And what it does is look at the connections, or, the alleged connections, between the Quran and modern scientific discoveries. So the whole thing really kicks off with this one big question. How could an ancient text, we're talking something written over 1,400 years ago, possibly contain knowledge about the natural world that, we'd only figure out with our fancy modern technology centuries later? It's a bold claim, for sure. So let's take a look at the arguments it lays out. Okay, so here's the approach. The source basically puts things side by side. It takes specific passages from the Quran and compares them directly with findings from huge fields like cosmology, geology, and biology. So, just to be super clear about this, the main argument here isn't that the Quran is a science textbook. Not at all. The source's point is that it contains these descriptions of the universe, of life, that the author argues line up surprisingly well with modern science. And our job here, we're just going to walk you through that argument. All right, let's start big. I mean, really big. We're talking about the universe itself. The source kicks things off with a few examples from cosmology and geology to build its case. First up, the very beginning of everything. The source points to a passage that describes the heavens and the earth as being this one, joined substance before they were separated. And then it puts that right next to the Big Bang Theory. The idea that our entire universe started from a single, super concentrated point before it exploded outward. Then there's the whole idea of the universe getting bigger. The source hones in on this one verse that says, and we are expanding it. Notice the tense there, are expanding, like it's happening right now. Now compare that to what we found out in the 20th century. For the longest time, everyone just assumed the universe was static, fixed. Then Edwin Hubble comes along and proves, nope, everything is actually moving away from everything else. The universe is still expanding today. That was a huge deal. Okay, coming back down to Earth now, let's talk about geology. The source highlights how the Quran describes mountains as pegs. Now think about that. What does a peg do? It anchors something, right? Well, modern geology tells us that's kind of exactly what mountains do. They have these massive roots that go deep into the Earth's crust, helping to stabilize the tectonic plates, just like a peg holding down a tent. So we've gone from the scale of the entire cosmos right down to our own planet. Now, the source zooms in even further, to the blueprint of life itself. This one is really interesting. The source argues that the Quran lays out a very specific sequence for how an embryo develops. It's described as starting from a drop, then becoming a clinging thing, which is interpreted as the embryo implanting itself. From there, it becomes a lump, and then bones are formed, and after that, the bones are clothed with flesh. The whole point the source is making is that this specific order, it seems to match up really closely with the stages we now know from modern embryology. Okay, moving on from that specific process, the source then zooms out a bit to talk about a more general idea it finds in the text, this concept of duality, that everything was created in pairs. And this idea of pairs gets applied to all sorts of things. I mean, you have the obvious one, male and female, in biology, but the source points to others, like positive and negative charges in chemistry, or how saltwater and freshwater can meet but not mix, forming a sort of barrier. Even things like the layers of darkness you find in the deep, deep ocean. And it also includes the water cycle, evaporation, clouds, rain, a whole process that really we didn't fully grasp until much, much later. So after laying out all these individual examples, the source brings it all together for its final big picture argument. And this one is all about probability. The source counts them up. In total, it identifies 15 separate scientific concepts, including the ones we've just touched on. 15 distinct points where it claims the text aligns with modern science. And here's the real kicker of the argument. The author basically says, look, you could maybe dismiss any one of these as just a coincidence, right? Or maybe poetic language. But what about all of them together? When you have 15 different examples, from the giant scale of the expanding universe, all the way down to how an embryo develops, all lining up with science that was discovered more than 1,000 years later, well, the source argues that the odds of all of that being just a massive coincidence gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that brings us right back to the central question this whole source is built around. When you see an ancient text and modern science seem to line up on so many different points, what does it all mean? The source definitely has its own answer to that question, but as always, we're going to leave that final thought with you.